for the second and hopefully second amendment debates between the DC Defense Coalition and we have students from Towson University. I want to begin with some thank yous, introduce our judges. We're going to have some brief remarks and then we'll get right into it, which you all came here for. And so first and most importantly, on behalf of myself, on behalf of the court, the coaches, and especially the residents, you might not hear as often from people who are incarcerated, but we want to thank the U.S. Marshal Service because they are the people who have the courage to make this happen. If you look at the newspaper, I'll be the one with the camera who gets on it, but they're doing all the actual work, and so I just want to give it up for our marshals and Marshal Carter in particular. I especially want to thank our Chief Judge Boasberg. He could not be here today, but he sends his regards. I also, it's rare at the trial court we do this, so I want to thank the nerds upstairs, like the circuit, the DC circuit. Chief Judge Srinivasan also sends his regards. He was apologized that he couldn't be here, but is excited for the next debate and an opportunity to judge it. We're so grateful for the support you'll see from not just this court, but judges and courts all in the DMV area because we are one DMV family. Very appreciative for the support for those from the judges. The second most important thank you, and one that probably means the most to me, my friend's wife, because my wife is too polite to do things, told me a lot of times what happens is that sometimes a woman will do a lot of work and a man will just take credit for it, and that's like waking up from the Matrix. I've learned now that maybe that's what I do. I am doing that to a level that's unprecedented with the coaches because I didn't do anything. I truly did not. I was there to be a cheerleader at the beginning, and now today we have the coaches. I'm so grateful to them all. Lena Bader, Tori Schieber, Aaron Barrett, Jackson Erpenbach, Sarah Istel, and Kumail Zaidi. They're all up in the front row. They go every Tuesday and Wednesday. It's volunteer. This is something they took on and chose to do, to go in because they believe in the humanity and the worth of the people who are incarcerated and have made it part of their already very, very busy lives. These are all very accomplished people, and I'm just super appreciative to them, as I know the students are as well, for the sacrifice they made in order to coach this team and get them ready to kick some butt. I especially want to thank the DOC staff, Department of Corrections. Again, that's not something maybe you hear every day, but I am deeply grateful to the DC Department of Corrections because they didn't have to make any of this possible. Their job isn't necessarily to do all these things, but they actually believe it is. They refer to our students as residents. It's little things like that that I think shows their commitment. I'm especially grateful to Ms. Williams, Takeda Williams, who is always with me in these ventures, General Counsel Andrew Kelly, who hear from a little bit, Satara Gell, and Jason McCready, who couldn't be here, the head of education. He's out on leave, but he's the one who actually helped us get the program kicked off. We have some additional staff from DOC as well. So thank you to DOC. Thank you for being a partner. Thank you for trying to You notice this is a mixed sex class. There is no other, as I know of it, jail facility in the country or prison that has men and women learning together when they're incarcerated. The DC jail was the first to start that, thanks to Georgetown University. I'm so appreciative to Georgetown for having the courage to ask that, and the jail having the courage to do it. We've never had an issue, not one, zero. And so that just goes to show, give people a little bit of faith in them and let them shine, and they've done it. So thank you to the DOC. I want to introduce our esteemed panel of judges who will judge the debate. I'm going to start at the end. First off, I'm going to start with Judge Daphne Friedrich. She has a very impressive resume. I'm not going to tell you that part. I'm going to tell the person that I know. Last time she got stuck in an elevator when we had the debate, and she still made it here. So this time I asked her, please take the stairs. But I think the point remains is that not even getting stuck in the elevator would stop her from coming here. She goes to the Department of Corrections as one of the most visited people there at the jail. She's always there finding ways to try to lift people up and finding ways to just open up paths of understanding. I so admire and appreciate her. She has been a great partner in this, and unlike me, she's unwilling to take credit, but I am happy to have the microphone and not let her say that she doesn't deserve it. So I'm very grateful to have you as a friend and mentor, as someone who teaches every day by example. I want to next move to Judge Qureshi. Judge Qureshi is here from the District of Maryland. The other Judge Qureshi looks like me in terms of hair and size. And so this is the first time in my life he's just taller, has more hair and better looking. So great to meet you. I'm glad now that we are friends in real life. Judge Tracy has a pretty incredible career. I do want to highlight one part I think is really important. So he worked at the ACLU. He was the director of the Civil Rights Clinic at Howard University School of Law. And he's worked quite a bit at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for many years, serving in the senior counsel until he became a judge. Judge Friedrich was a prosecutor before she came here. I was a prosecutor, and here's some of the other judges are prosecutors as well. We don't have Mr. Cunningham here this time to talk about people's party affiliations, I'm glad to say, but you can watch the YouTube clip, and he did a good job trying to get me in hot water. But I'll say this, what you see here in this courthouse is marshals, jail staff, incarcerated students, prosecutors, defense lawyers, we're all working together. It is in fact possible. No hate to our TV friends, but if you just turn off the news for a minute, or turn some of the noise up that's outside, we actually can work together to do good and important things. And it is in little and small things, but also big things. Every one of the people here is here today, including you all, sacrificing some time. So those folks there know you are not forgotten, you have incredible worth, and we're looking forward to learning from both sides of the students. But I'm especially appreciative that judges from these diverse backgrounds are here to remind us that we're not defined by anything other than, I think, our humanity. That's what Judge Chasnow, I am probably one of our biggest fans. She is coming from the District of Maryland as well. We have had the pleasure of working together on a committee at the Administrative Office of Courts, and my daughter goes to school in her neighborhood in Greenbelt. And I was talking about my fears of DC traffic, and she just said, just send your daughter anytime she's stuck or after school, I'll take care of her. And that's the kind of person she is. So you can hear from anywhere else what an incredible jurist is. She's been the chief judge of the District of Maryland. She's had a storied career, but people when they are in those positions of authority aren't often volunteering to babysit for somebody else who's in a junior position of authority. And that's the kind of person that she is. When I asked her to come here, she said, sure, can I bring some more people with me? So again, I see every day what you all don't get to see. I'm so fortunate. I get to see the humanity of judges every day and know that they are real people who care about people. And I hope that you have a chance to see that today and be as impressed by the judiciary as I am. Next, I have Judge Fitzpatrick. Judge Fitzpatrick is a former prosecutor from the Eastern District of Virginia. Before becoming a judge in the Eastern District and making the long trip across the Potomac, thank you, he served as in the assistant Commonwealth Attorney in Fairfax, and then as an AUSA, where he eventually served as the chief and deputy chief of many units, including the chief of the Financial Crime and Public Corruption Unit. He also oversees the drug court in EDBA. It's not a program we have here, but thank you for setting an example. That is a pretrial diversion program that they have there that he and Judge Nachmanoff have, and it's something for us to aspire to. Finally, I will say most importantly, because my wife would say that, I have the former United States Attorney from the Eastern District of Washington, the first female U.S. Attorney for that district in the history of the United States, Vanessa Waldorf. She was also the officiant at my wedding. She was here yesterday we're very fortunate, she was here to speak among a Supreme Court Justice, 2 Chief Judges, and the Federal Public Defender. She spoke at Judge Bates' portrait ceremony. His portrait will be up shortly. I assume I don't have to hang it up. Someone's going to get it up there on the wall. But anyway, she spoke yesterday in front of 4 Supreme Court Justices in this very room. So first of all, I want our students to know you're in the same room that less than 24 hours 4 Supreme Court Justices were in. And I also want you to know, because I'll put on the spot, I'm willing to bet anything that Vanessa is more honored and more excited to speak to you all and be here today, even as she was yesterday. But I won't make her say it because the judge is in the building. But Vanessa was, as I said, the first U.S. Attorney, female Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington. She worked in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division at DOJ, and then before that as a prosecutor, before she became the Senate-confirmed lead prosecutor. She currently works at a law firm where she continues her focus on plaintiff side work as well as focus on environmental. So let's do a big round of applause for our judges. I'm most excited to introduce, of course, above all, our students, our scholars. I am so grateful to you all for the work that you have put in. I've heard about from the coaches. I know that you've been grinding. I know the place that you're at, as hard as the DOC works, it's still a jail at the end of the day. And it's hard to learn inside of a jail, but you all put learning above all else, and so I'm so proud of you. So I want to give a shout out today Today arguing for the affirmative, the DC Defense Coalition. Those that have a speaking role today are Khalil Hewitt-Felder, you can stand up. Charles Brooks. Gianni Robinson. London Teeter. Aisha Marks, or Taz. Sherry Bell, or Duda. You also have the team's alternate speakers, who are absolutely essential, just as important as speakers. They're the ones who they're scrimmaging against in the practices during the week, and they're here to pick up the baton if it's ever needed. So I'm so grateful to them for preparing our speakers to do their thing. And so I want to recognize them as well. Anthony Hargrove. James Kennard, representing YME. Melvin Grayson, our other mentor, the Young Men Merchant Group. Fujita Hamilton. And Ashley Gauss-Craig. Arguing the negative, we have Towson University debate team. I'm very appreciative. I actually started mine, sitting in the seat. I started my collegiate career at Towson University on the debate team. It opened up opportunities for me. So I'm very grateful that you all are much better and motivated than me doing something like this when I was sitting in the dorm room. So thank you. The debate team includes Daniel Christ, Katie Gebermedin, Jasmine Moudin, Noah Gardner, and their coach is Michael Harrington. Welcome to House Debate. I just asked for some brief remarks before we get started from two people who have been very instrumental in getting us started. I'm going to start with Marshall Carter. I just put him on the spot.
Good afternoon, everyone. He definitely put me on the spot. I know I was good this time. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'd like to thank the judge for his leadership. Putting something like this together is significant. I'd like to thank my team for having patience with me, for organizing such an event. And just, looking forward to, hearing the voices from all the people sitting across the room. So, welcome.
Marshall Carter, is he a quarterback yet or no? Oh, I'm sorry. You see what I'm saying? So I got to give him a little bit. All right. Next we hear from Mr. Mazzucchelli.
Thank you, Greg. Hi, everyone. How's it going? I'm Mr. Mazzucchelli. I'm the General Counsel for the Department of Corrections. It's great to be here for a second time now, and I thought the first time was great, but I have a feeling that this is going to be the best yet. And it really, I'm overwhelmed by just pride and just being able to sort of be here to experience this. Everyone, that's a participant, they had, the choice to sort of, engage with this program or not, and they chose to do so. And it's something that I think that will truly help them and everyone here just to sort of expand their skills in this particular setting, and I'm extremely excited to sort of hear what each and every one of you have to say. This is a great opportunity, great program. It's something that I've been working extremely closely with, and it's something that it's one particular program that I have a great deal of pride in. It's fantastic, and I truly am excited to sort of hear what everyone has to say. So thank you very much.
All right, well, I'll just quickly say, I'm super excited. Thank you all. Can't thank everyone enough for being here. I'm going to get into it. I want to tell our students one thing. There's only one person wearing orange today. You all look great, right? Okay? This is, remember, looking good, feeling good. I'm so proud of you all. I decided already what we're gonna do for the third debate is we need walk-up music, so I'm gonna leave with mine. So we're gonna have for next time. I'm a little voice, right? I wonder. Okay, y'all got this. Can we please have speaker one, the affirmative team's first constructive argument? This will 7 to 9 minutes. I will call out at the 9th minute. And just give me 1 moment to turn off my eyes and get the clock off. Okay, Benny, when you are.
Good afternoon. My name is Khalil. Although you may not physically see the restraints I am bound by. Good afternoon. My name is Khalil. Although you may not see the restraints I am bound by, I am shocked by a 10-year mandatory minimum for a non-violent crime, as is 72% of the people that's incarcerated in prison today. This is one of many reasons why I position that mandatory minimum should be abolished. That means all mandatory minimums at the federal level. Mandatory minimums should be abolished for the following reasons. First, mandatory minimums were enacted to create uniformity and consistency, but have a fact on the opposite, create inequality and treat all criminal acts the same regardless of context. Second, mandatory minimums have resulted in racial bias in sentencing. Third, mandatory minimums do not deter crime and relate. Fourth, mandatory minimums have increased prison population, exacerbating mass incarceration. First, mandatory minimums create unequal sentencing. The inconsistent application of mandatory minimums has increased disparities by expanding the sentencing differential between analogous cases and by requiring the same base sentences in penalty dissimilar cases. As Eric Lewin wrote in Reform of Criminal Justice, Volume 4, equality in the classical sense requires the sentence makers not only treat like cases alike, but also treat dissimilar cases different. It would thus be a violation of equality for relevantly dissimilar offenders to receive analogous sentences, just as it would be for relevantly similar offenders to receive disparate sentences. Uniformity is also undermined by the so-called cliff effect of mandatory minimum that draws seemingly trivial lines with huge consequences. The most striking example often involves illegal drugs, where offenders face steep cliffs at quantity cutoffs. Someone caught with 0.9 grams of LSD might receive a relatively short sentence, but add on a fraction of a gram, and a decade in federal prison necessary follows, with the defendant falling off the metaphorical cliff. Likewise, mandatory minimums have a terrible effect, where some basic fact triggers the mandatory minimums regardless of what the defendant was. For instance, a low-level drug courier or instead a narcotics kingpin. Ideally, the sentencing judge should be able to look at someone as a complete human being and carefully calibrate punishment based on a personal history, military service, children, family, motivation for a crime. For instance, was the person desperate or greedy? Was the person a pawn or a kingpin? Was the person in need of a treatment or punishment? But none of this happened when the mandatory minimum shocked the judge. Or as Stefan Biddles wrote for the Harvard Law Review, mandatory minimums act as sludge hammers rather than scalpels, falling with equal force on people who are dramatically different from each other. Judges agree. As Judge Scheinman of the Southern District wrote for the Washington Post, quote, I was often prohibited from exercising a defendant's history, personal characteristics or role in offense. In sentencing, where judgment should matter the most, I cannot exercise my judgment. I feel more like a computer than a judge. Mandatory minimums does offer the illusion of equality through semblance of mathematical objectivity, while disregarding all information written about the defendant in his or her life. Second, mandatory minimums are not just unequal administration, they are racially biased. Study after study confirms that prosecutors charge mandatory minimums substantially more against black defendants, as Allison Siegler found in a report for the Brain Center in 2021. Prosecutor use of mandatory minimums in over half of federal cases disproportionately impacts poor people of color and has driven an exponential growth in federal prison population in recent decades. The Brain Center report also confirms that prosecutors bring mandatory minimums 65% more against black defendants, all else remaining equal. Some prosecutors charge black and Latino individuals more often than white individuals with possession or sale of a quantity of drugs just sufficient to trigger the mandatory minimum. The disparity is highest in states with high levels of racial anomaly. At the federal level, 2017 United States Sentencing Commission report on drug sentences revealed that black people were most likely to have been sentenced under the mandatory minimum than any other group. In federal drug crimes, which are the most common federal offenses subject to a mandatory minimum, 70% of the people who prosecute to choose with a mandatory minimum are people of color, as documented in the Journal of Political Economics. And individuals state that discrepancy is appalling. A 2019 study found that people of color in New York made up for 91% of arrests for crimes that carry mandatory minimum, whereas whites made up only 7%. One study confirms that eliminating mandatory minimums could reduce the number of black men in federal prison by 10,000, with a cost savings of over $230 million per year. Third, mandatory minimums do not decrease crime. Indeed, the vast body of this research clearly states that mandatory minimums have little to no deterrent effect. Defendants subject to mandatory minimums are likely unaware of them, therefore rendering deterrence moot. Deterrence assumes that people will, 1, research the criminal code, 2, find a relevant mandatory penalty, and 3, be discouraged from criminal activity. In reality, people are not aware of mandatory minimums when they commit a crime. The recently updated model penal code confirms that deterrence is difficult to achieve the sentencing scheme because defendants are routinely sent to learn the length of sentences they are facing and incredulous that the judge cannot do anything about it. In addition, as Daniel Nagin, a leading deterrence scholar in the United States, concludes, mandatory minimums do not deter in part because it is the certainty of punishment or the fear of punishment that deters, not the length of punishment. Therefore, increasing the penalty or the severity of punishment as mandatory minimum does is ineffective at deterring people and engaging in criminal activity. This is not just rational, it is statistical proven. States that remove mandatory minimums had decreased crime rates, while states that enacted mandatory minimums had increased crime rates. Over 30 states have repealed or reformed the mandatory minimums in the past 2 decades while maintaining public safety. In 2015, when Pennsylvania mandatory minimum sentences were struck down as unconstitutional, crime rates and prison population rates declined. In 2017, Louisiana repealed its mandatory minimums and in the first 6 months alone saved $12 million and decreased prison costs. Since then, the state's prison population has dropped to a level not seen since the 1990s. The states had reinvested savings to crime reduction and victim support programs which actually deter crime. By contrast, according to the Brain Center, Florida experienced a 50% spike in crime after it enacted the mandatory minimum. Fourth, mandatory minimums not only do not deter crime, they increase the length of incarceration stay, serving as the cornerstone of the human cage system. The United States has the largest prison population, both American and per capita, in the world. More than 2.2 million people are currently incarcerated. This means that 1 in 100 adults in our country is behind bars. And while the United States accounts for only 5% of the world's population, we hold 25% of the world's prisoners. The average prison time served by federal defendants more than doubled after the guidelines created mandatory minimums became effective. The federal prison system by 2013 held nearly 800% more inmates than in 1980 pre-mandatory minimums. In fact, the average time served by drug offenders spent behind bars increased 153% between 1980 and 2012 from 23.2 to 58.6 months. This increase dwarfs the 39 and 44% growth in time served by property and violent offenders respectively during the same period, demonstrating that mandatory minimums are not fostering mass incarceration, they are doing so for non-violent offenders and not violent offenders. The U.S. Sentencing Commission, the vast body of literature, likewise confirms that mandatory minimum penalties contribute to the rise of federal prison population, which also makes rational sense. Harsh mandatory penalties resulting in needless long sentences are undeniable contributing factor to mass incarceration. Mandatory minimums therefore also balloon costs, with estimates that prison costs between 4.5 to 6.7 billion annually, up from less than 1 billion pre-mandatory minimums, depending on calculation including laws, revenue, and society. Taxpayers spent as much on federal prison in 2013 that they spent to fund the entire U.S. Justice Department, including the FBI, DEA, and the U.S. Attorney Office nationally. In conclusion, mandatory minimums acted to create uniformity have only served as to dehumanize sentencing and prevent judges from ensuring the punishment fits the actual crime. They also fail to deter crime, instead resulting in increased incarceration, increased calls, and increased racial bias. The equality provided by mandatory minimum is simple illusory. The numeric equality of mandatory minimum does not uphold the rule of law and is deeply unjust, and the levels of incarcerated persons resulting in mandatory minimums is disgraceful and antithetical to the country we claim to be. It is not exaggeration to say, as the federal criminal Justice Clinton testified before Congress and advocated the end of mandatory minimum, that we are indeed facing a national emergency. We cannot be a country that treats humans as mathematical equations subject to the same crime being dramatically different. We must be a country that treats humans as humans, that show punishment fits crimes, and focus on how to decrease crime and not increase prison population. Thank you.
Across
examination. All right, and we have from the negative, I think, the closer to the greater. We have 3 minutes to cross-examination. You may begin.
What does justice look like in the world of the affirmative?
Can you repeat the question again?
What does justice look like in the world of the affirmative?
Just equal justice.
Is this one? What does justice look like in the world of the affirmative?
The word of fundament that abolish and make, our position is that mandatory minimum should be abolished because it disproportionately affects people of color.
Correct. Simple possession charges don't land mandatory minimum sentences. You need at least a kilogram of a drug. What does justice look like for this?
It's disproportionate.
So how are we able to judge specifically where disproportionate kicks in? Where does it move from simple possession into a drug trafficking charge?
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so you made this argument that it's disproportionate. How is a judge in every instance supposed to understand what sentences look like when there are hundreds of different cases litigated every day? So how do we understand where the disproportionality kicks in?
Actually, the prosecutors are the ones that weaponize the use of mandatory minimum. So they control the sentence of a defendant.
So how does the 1AC remove the prosecutor's impact on that when they can still recommend above the mandatory minimum after the affirmative has passed?
Could you repeat the question again?
Sure, so like we abolish mandatory minimums. Prosecutors can still recommend an unusually high sentence. How does the affirmative solve that?
Because abolish a mandatory minimum will take the power out of prosecutors' hand and let the judge have the discretion to make case based.
In the criminal cases, though, the prosecutor still has to recommend a sentence to the judge. What stops unusual prosecutors from recommending unusually high sentences?
Actually, prosecutors are actually biased because they charge 65% more against black defendants than any other race.
Okay, how does removing mandatory minimums stop that, considering mandatory minimums are only about sentencing and not about convictions?
Could you repeat the question again?
Sure, mandatory minimums kick in the sentencing procedure. How does the affirmative stop the disproportionate trial of racial minorities in front of prosecutors?
By abolishing mandatory minimum.
How does that stop the disproportionate sentencing of minority populations when that happens after they've already been convicted in the sentencing process?
By actually giving the discretion to the judges, not the prosecutors.
Okay. So how should we understand and think about what the stories and the different disproportionalities that you have posited be compared to other research and data that contradicts your understandings of mandatory minimums?
Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
Yeah, how should we think about and evaluate the comparative analysis between our data that we're going to provide and your account of personal experiences and the way in which things are disproportionately applied?
Because the prosecutor choose who to charge, weaponize mandatory minimums to who to charge it with.
That's time, thank you. We now have the negative team's first constructive argument.
The United States should not abolish mandatory minimums, but reform the ways we carry out mandatory minimums by expanding judicial discretion, retroactive reformation, and alternative sentencing options. According to the United States Sentencing Commission, in 2023, only 27.7% of individuals who committed sexual abuse, rape, were convicted and carried a mandatory minimum. The average sentence for individuals convicted of abusive sexual contact was 37 months, and the average sentence for people convicted of statutory rape was only 48 months. These convictions and carrying mandatory minimums are extremely low and consistently showcase why mandatory minimums are productive to achieve justice for the survivors of sexual abuse. Although there will be great arguments by the affirmative to showcase why some cases carrying a mandatory minimum penalty seem drastically high as it relates to drug trafficking, they miss the mark on how drug trafficking coincides with sexual abuse, which is often undermined and not accounted for when drug charges are the overwhelming majority. The issues the affirmative takes with mandatory minimum sentences aren't considering both the historical success of the judicial system in improving and aiming to reduce recidivism rates and the recent cutbacks to federal sentencing guidelines, which have allowed judges to have more flexibility in the judicial process. Mandatory minimums are policy changes brought about in the mid-'80s, an element of the Reagan and Bush era tough on crime mindset and public distress over the drug epidemic in the United States. This is credence as to why drug trafficking percentages are much higher than other categories. Since then, public perception on drug-related crime has drastically changed, and much of the discourse over mandatory minimum sentences do not take place under that framework. For example, mandatory minimum sentences for simple drug possession have not been imposed for decades since the peak of the war on drugs. The affirmative ignores how most of the cases related to mandatory minimums are for people moving drugs, not simple possessions. Yes, the affirmative will make arguments that there are examples of this still occurring. However, those are drops in the bucket, and we should use those stories to continually improve policy, because those stories help us improve and make policy better, not just by simply eliminating minimums and losing the benefits they provide. The 2018 First Step Act has rolled back harsh penalties for simple possession. The law recognizes the difference between users and traffickers and has adjusted itself accordingly, only made possible by learning from past policy failure and improving them. Heather McDonald, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, explains the arguments the affirmative makes, ignores that minimums don't apply to most possession crimes and have been effective in solving drug trafficking and organized crime. For a mandatory federal sentence to come into play, a dealer has to be caught with an amount of drug that reveals large-scale trafficking. To trigger a mandatory 10-year sentence, a heroin trafficker has to be caught with a kilogram of the drug. That's an amount that represents 10,000 doses and is worth over $100,000. The number of federal convictions for simple possession is negligible. Most of these were plea bargained down from trafficking charges. Now, mandatory minimum sentences have a far broader and more socially advantageous purpose than incarcerating people for possessing drugs. According to Bill Otis, former federal prosecutor, mandatory minimums have been a huge success. They cut the crime rate in half. Additionally, even minimums for low-level offenders help to slash crime rates. If one judges the success of the criminal justice system by the crime rate rather than the incarceration rate, mandatory minimums have been a huge success. Crime is half of what it was in the 1980s. Furthermore, an escalation of crime, or at least perception of crime not being resolved, leads to community violence. David Kennedy, professor of criminal justice and director of the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, explains that there will always be an irreducible role for state power in public safety. It's not just facing facts, it's a good thing. It's the core of the social contract. The availability of that power to communities means they aren't on their own and don't have to rely on their own capacities to be safe. It means they can get help and protection when they need it, that the potentially dangerous and violent know that and restrain themselves. I also want to highlight how abolishing mandatory minimums leads to making incarceration worse, because it backlogs the court system while people are holding. Without certain automatic sentencing, everybody goes through the same sentencing process, which ensures the process is longer and does the exact opposite of what the affirmative indicates they want to resolve: mass incarceration. Next, the crime legislation at the end of the 20th century has been extremely effective in reduction and deterrence of crime, and specifically drug trafficking, a business which has destroyed communities and countless lives. However, policy is rarely perfect upon introduction, and there are those that have been victims of injustice. To account for those who have undeservedly been given sentences beyond what they deserve, Congress has taken multiple steps already to reform the system, making it fairer for all, as the affirmative desires. The first of these actions was taken in 1994 by introducing the safety valve. The purpose of this is to allow judges to give sentences below the minimum requirement in certain circumstances. The safety valve is available to those who meet 5 specific criteria related to their offense. According to Charles Doyle, senior specialist at the Library of Congress, the 5 qualifications for the safety valve are not having a disqualifying criminal history, not having used violence or a weapon in the crime, not being an organizer or leader in the drug enterprise, providing the government with all information in relation to the crime, and the offense may not have resulted in serious injury or death. The safety valve is available for those it is designed for, the folks that the affirmative has isolated. Remember, our argument is about reforming the ways in which mandatory minimums are carried out, and we would indicate that expanding principles like the safety valve to be more considerate and open to offenders would be an example of this, because it expands judicial discretion and allows for alternative sentencing options. To extend the fact that sufficient reforms of mandatory minimums are already in effect, I would like to talk about the First Step Act of 2018. Liz Comar, a sentencing reform counsel at the Sentencing Project, indicates that the First Step Act seeks to expand opportunities for people in federal prisons to participate in rehabilitative programming to support their success after release. Among the nearly 30,000 individuals whose release has been expedited by the First Step Act, nearly 9 in every 10 have not been rearrested or reincarcerated. This 12% recidivism rate lies in stark contrast with the more typical 45% recidivism rate among people released from federal prison. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 lowered the notorious disparity in mandatory minimum drug quantity triggers for crack versus powder cocaine offenses from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. The First Step Act made the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive. This means people convicted of certain offenses involving crack cocaine in the past can now seek to have their sentence reduced as if the new guidelines applied when their crime was committed. The First Step Act expanded good time credits by specifying that incarcerated individuals can now earn up to 54 days of good time credit for every year of their imposed sentence. And finally, the First Step Act reduced the length of some mandatory minimum sentences prospectively, giving judges more discretion in sentencing. The First Step Act is an example of our second plank of retroactive reform, seeking to change serving sentences for those already incarcerated based on retroactive acts, fixing current policy. Now imagine this. Your mother decides to meet with someone. You don't know who they are. It was a man. She sold you to a trafficker when you were 14 years old. You were forced into prostitution and forced labor. You were bonded and taken from place to place. The traffickers found out you had an American passport and used you to mule drugs internationally. The whole time you wanted to scream and run, but your trafficker was right next to you and continued to say that if you said anything, he would kill you. This is DJ's story. DJ is one of millions of people trafficked every year. Victims like her are exploited for forced labor, organ trade, and prostitution. But it did not end here. DJ was one of the few lucky people to have escaped from her trafficker. She is now a voice for thousands of survivors of human trafficking who have gone through similar circumstances that she did. Maintaining mandatory minimums ensures that survivors like DJ receive justice for the harms they had to endure at the expense of people committing heinous acts, but also for the future children who would have had to endure those same harms under that individual. Mandatory minimums are essential to ensure that certain people are held accountable, and that's what it means to vote negative in this debate. Ensuring accountability for those who have committed heinous acts like rape, trafficking, and drug distribution, which often coincide with each other. Thank you.
Okay, we'll have a cross-examination.
You claim that mandatory minimums to deter crime. Do you know which states have reformed their mandatory minimum sentences, whether crime has decreased or increased in those states? Yes or no?
I don't know. We're talking about federal mandatory minimums, though, not state.
Okay, Louisiana and Pennsylvania appealed most of their mandatory minimums in 2017 and 2015. Both crime rates and prison population declined. Why doesn't this why doesn't this disprove your entire argument?
You're isolating examples from states, and we're talking about federal sentencing guidelines, not state sentencing guidelines. I don't know what crimes they have mandatory minimums for. It's different.
I don't think you understand my question. This is on a federal level. So these 30 states have reformed or repealed their mandatory minimum sentences in the past 2 decades while maintaining public safety. Do you know in those states whether the crime increased or decreased?
You just said it decreased.
Mandatory minimum, isn't it true that mandatory minimums intended for higher level drug traffickers? Isn't it true that mandatory minimums are intended for higher level drug traffickers? If so, then how come mandatory minimums affect low level drug offenses most of the time, including users?
Well, first of all, mandatory minimums apply to a range of crimes, not just drug trafficking. That includes rape, abusive sexual contact. But what was the second part of your question?
If this is so, why does mandatory minimums affect low-level drug offenses most of the time, including users?
Well, like I said, that has been a problem. The incarceration rates in the United States have been a problem in the past several decades, and that's why there have been reforms taken to the policies of mandatory minimums. That includes the safety valve, which for first-time offenders, for non-violent crimes.
Okay, thank you. Respectfully, I have another question. Are you aware that according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, 72.3 of cases carry a mandatory minimum are for drug trafficking?
Yes.
Do you know what the percentage of cases carrying a mandatory minimum penalty are for nonviolent offenses? Yes or no?
No.
Seems like you don't know the answer. I'll move on to the next question. A brain center study found that mandatory minimum charges result in black individuals spending more time in prison than whites for exact the same crime. If mandatory minimums have been determined to result in unequal prosecution, shouldn't they be abolished?
I'll give you time to answer the question.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear it.
Mandatory minimum charges result in black individuals spending more time in prison more often than whites for exactly the same crimes. If mandatory minimums have been demonstrated to result in unequal prosecution, shouldn't they be abolished?
We're not arguing that they're perfect. We're arguing that they're necessary and more reforms can be taken to fix those disparities.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Jackson Wooden, and I'm the negative teen from Towson, Brooklyn. I got you. Okay. I'll start.
Yes, sir.
Judge, this debate is about whether abolishing mandatory minimums actually solves the problem of mass incarceration, and it should be weighed with these considerations. First, whether the affirmative addresses the root causes of incarceration, and second, whether that plan improves public safety or creates new systemic problems. The affirmative claims that abolishing mandatory minimums will significantly reduce mass incarceration, but this argument rests on a narrow assumption that sentencing policy alone drives the problem. In reality, the carceral system is far more complex. Mandatory minimums are just one piece to a massive machine, and although imperfect, NOVA did a great job highlighting on how things like safety, the Safety Valve Act, and First Step Act have been game changers to address inadequacies, which is why you should defer to not abolishing mandatory minimums, but reform the ways we carry out mandatory minimums by expanding the discretion, retroactive reformation, and alternative sentencing options. Multiple experts support this claim. James Collins, a research and program associate at Brennan Center for Justice, writes that mandatory minimums are already in decline. This means that the elimination of mandatory minimums doesn't serve the purpose of actually creating justice, like the affirmative indicates. It just takes away a process that should be there in certain instances. This means the affirmative plan to dismantle only risks a net harm and no net benefit to doing the plan, because the system is already adapted, slowly yet gradually. Professor Douglas Berman from the U.S. Sentencing Commission still governs how judges sentence, and even if mandatory minimums are abolished, harsh sentencing patterns will persist. Nasco and Mora of the Sentencing Project cited in a Gauge 2019 report how other insurance policies like three-strike laws, truth in sentencing rules, and federal drug guidelines will continue locking people up for long stretches, regardless of the affirmative's proposal. At best, the affirmative creates additional problems, and they don't resolve their own issues. To be clear, we're making the argument that mandatory minimums, with things that allow for us to expand procedures like the Safety Valve Act and First Step Act, at least creates more equitability to allow for judge discretion. They also trade one crisis for another. Let's look at offense level disadvantages. If mandatory minimums are abolished, more defendants may take their chances at trial rather than accept the plea. This increases courtroom congestion, what we call court clog disadvantage, which slows justice, burdens victims, and drains resources. Worse, that's a public safety cost. Mandatory minimums serve as deterrents, especially for repeat offenders or violent offenders. Without them, there's less incentive to avoid high-risk crime. Robert Verbergen, a criminal justice researcher at Manhattan Institute, writes that the studies show mandatory minimums can correlate with reduced recidivism, especially when consistently and predictably enforced. Any of them could reduce the perceived cost of crime and open the door to higher offense rates, make communities less safe. Our world better reflects reality. There's so many alternative causes that perpetuate the failing of the sentencing process that the affirmative doesn't account for and will intentionally increase. And this is where the affirmative case falls apart. They act like they can fix the system just by cutting mandatory minimums, forgetting those laws were put in place for a reason. They were designed in part to address disparities in sentencing, enforce consistency, and deter the most severe crimes. The policy has undeniably been misused at times, but that doesn't mean it lacks value, which is the argument they don't address. We learn from the policy failure to improve the system to incorporate new things, not just throw things out. No in the previous speech made this point clear. The policy can work when applied justly. The problem is not the law itself, but how it is enforced. Which is why our common plan of expanded judicial discretion, retroactive reformation, and alternative sentencing options resolves the affirmative's impacts better while avoiding the trade-off of the crime increase. Let me give you a clear example of why mandatory minimums are necessary and beneficial to society. In May of 2024, Jason Xavier Villanueva, identified as a major supplier in the Carlton juvenile fentanyl overdose case, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. This case involved the tragic deaths of 4 children due to fentanyl overdoses. Villanueva's sentencing underscores how mandatory minimums serve as a tool to hold drug traffickers accountable and send a strong message about the consequences of distributing lethal substances. That's what mandatory minimums do when they are used as intended. They protect. They abolish mandatory minimums, but bail still jails the poor, fines still recriminalize poverty. Supervision still cycles poor people back into cells. That's not real reform. It's a Band-Aid. They will inevitably go for it to step in the right direction. However, it fails to think about how mandatory minimums efforts have been an effective policy just enforced incorrectly. Even if you think some folks are getting wrongful mandatory minimums, that's not a reason the policy is bad, but the enforcement and process has been. Remember, our only job is to disprove the desirability of their plan in which the affirmative fails to resolve their own problem, which is all the alternative cause analysis done above. Besides this, they fail to account for an extensive reform of the combination of judicial discretion, retroactive reformation, and alternative sentencing options is far better option that avoids crime escalation and court cause disadvantage. That's my time.
Good afternoon. My name is S. Bill, your first affirmative rebuttalist. I'm 21 and a first-time offender. However, regardless of those 2 facts, I face a mandatory minimum of 15 years. I then reluctantly accepted a plea bargain for 5 years due to the statistical probability of me losing in trial. Unfortunately, my story is almost identical to the individuals behind me. I'll use this rebuttal not only to shed light on the flaws in my opponent's arguments, but to shed light on the flaws of both the system and the mandatory minimums as a whole. My opponents made some very opinionated points in their constructive argument. However, in their own repetitive way, their arguments themselves were biased, just as these mandatory minimums they so passionately want to impose. They say mandatory minimums have sufficient ways of reducing disproportionate sentences, like pardons, exceptions, and safety valves. However, relying on pardons, safety valves, and exceptions cannot compensate for a failing system. Pardons are often influenced by political considerations rather than fairness or justice. They do not provide a reliable safeguard against the excessive sentences imposed by mandatory minimums, leaving many individuals to serve unjust, disproportionate sentences. Exceptions are limited and fail to address the broader problem of inflexible sentencing laws. For example, safety valves typically apply to non-violent drug offenders. They also say that proven rapists were not given enough time, thus saying that mandatory minimums are used more often for rape offenders. While we agree that rape is undeniably heinous, deserving severe punishment, mandatory minimums do not deter such offenses effectively. Research proves that harsh sentencing laws, including mandatory minimums, have little impact on crime rates because offenders often act impulsively or with no regard of legal consequences. This is especially true in the context of many rape cases. Mandatory minimums for rape can also be unintended. Mandatory minimums for rape can also have unintended consequences that harm survivors. For example, rigid sentencing laws may discourage victims from coming forward if they believe the punishment is too severe for someone they know personally. Survivors often seek justice and accountability rather than extreme punitive measures, and mandatory minimums can complicate their ability to navigate the legal system in a way that aligns with their needs. They say repetitively that mandatory minimums lessen drug trafficking, thus saying that mandatory minimums deter crime and make the public safer, when in fact, mandatory minimums do not deter crime or make the public safer in almost any way. States that have reformed, repealed, or removed mandatory minimums have had significant decrease in crime rates, while states that have enacted mandatory minimums have had increase. In 2017, Louisiana repealed many of its mandatory minimums. The state's prison population has dropped to a level not seen since the 1990s. In 2015, Pennsylvania's many mandatory minimum sentences were struck as unconstitutional. Since this ruling, crime rates have continued to decline. In 2002, Michigan legislators repealed almost all mandatory drug sentences. The state's crime rate has dropped 27% in the decades following the reform. Even if mandatory minimums did actually deter crime, their benefits would not outweigh their many damages, like the fact that they massively increase incarceration, drain substantial resources away from rehabilitative and policing programs that actually decrease recidivism and deprive defendants of the right to trial. And those are just some. To conclude this rebuttal, I'll say this. Throughout any research on mandatory minimums, you'll see phrases like, regardless of individual circumstance, meaning regardless of one's potential, regardless of one's instability, and regardless of one's family, a judge can and will be forced to rectify dissimilar cases with an unfortunately similar amount of severity. Now, disregard all of these key facts, while deciphering was supposed to be a magnanimous decision, kind of forces one's thoughts from magnanimity to agenda, from noble justice to an honorable laws, from a safer society to the mass incarceration of men and women throughout our country. Mandatory minimums are biased, unjust, and extremely flawed. No better than the people they intend to punish. The only difference between the two is that people are innocent until proven guilty, and mandatory minimums have already proven themselves so. Thank you.
I want to remind you all of what this debate is about. It's not likely that getting rid of mandatory minimums would do anything to reduce rates of incarceration. Jasmine already described different examples of this, like the bail system, supervision metrics, and fines and fees. Eliminating mandatory minimums would lead to more sentencing trials, exacerbating court delays and making marginalized people wait longer for their court dates. And mandatory minimums help to deter violent criminals. They've ignored our community violence argument. Communities take matters into their own hands when they feel like nothing is being done, which spikes violent crime. This is all for Noah's speech. Therefore, you all should feel comfortable voting negative so we can create reforms to address issues. Our proposed reforms are expanding judicial discretion, retroactive reformation, and alternative sentencing options. First, I want to emphasize they cannot resolve the problems they presented. They claim that mandatory minimums should be abolished because they lead to mass incarceration. It's much more complicated than that, and banning a single element isn't going to make a difference. Instead, we need reforms for major issues. Mandatory minimums affect the sentencing process, but arrests and convictions happen before sentencing. Racism, militarization, poverty, and lack of mental health treatment are all contributing factors to mass incarceration and harmful police behavior. They will continue to exist if mandatory minimums are abolished. The Equal Justice Initiative indicates, over the last 5 decades, our country has criminalized an increasing number of behaviors and targeted Black communities and communities of color for over-policing and aggressive prosecution. Our country incarcerates hundreds of thousands of people who are not a threat to public safety. This happens before sentencing, meaning it won't be affected by the abolition of mandatory minimums. The affirmative cannot resolve this issue. There are also many other types of sentencing laws that contribute to mass incarceration. For example, the Brennan Center isolates 3 strikes laws. Under these laws, a person is considered to be beyond rehabilitation after committing 3 crimes. As a result, once they reach the 3rd strike, the penalty is much more severe than it would usually be. There are people today spending their lives in prison committing 3 petty crimes. And the truth in sentencing laws. If you're sentenced to 10 years in prison, you don't generally spend 10 years in prison. Most states let people earn time off their sentence for good behavior. Truth in sentencing laws eliminate those opportunities for early release requiring people to serve, but for example, 75% of their prison term physically behind bars. These laws lead to prolonged incarceration and disproportionately harsh sentences for petty crimes. These will still exist even if mandatory minimums are abolished, making things even worse because a mandatory minimum would remove the ability to reoffend. Next, I'd like to focus on the courts. Abolishing mandatory minimums could make mass incarceration worse and prolong trials. With mandatory minimums, there's an automatic sentence for serious crimes. Without them, every single person convicted of a crime needs to go through the sentencing process, meaning those cases will take much longer. There are already existing court backlogs. This is news from the U.S. courts from 2 months ago. The Judicial Conference of the United States today agreed to recommend to Congress the creation of new district and court of appeals judgeships as caseloads continue to mount. Burgeoning caseloads can lead to significant case delays. Delays result in increased costs for litigants and raise access to justice concerns. Court delays are harmful both to victims and defendants. Amanda Hernandez for State Line isolates. The bulk of the backlog in most states and counties are criminal trials. The backlog poses significant challenges for defendants whose right to a speedy trial can be jeopardized by extended pretrial detention. Those held in jail during pretrial detention may lose jobs and experience housing instability. And for crime victims, extended court proceedings can make navigating the already complex justice system even more difficult. Abolishing mandatory minimums will prevent defendants, survivors, and families of victims from receiving justice quickly. You might be thinking, how does the negative resolve any of this? First, our job is to show that their plan doesn't work. Any uncertainty of how they can overcome these issues means you can feel comfortable voting negative. We've made it clear that the affirmative cannot solve the structural issues they critique because of alternative causes. Next, our counterplan prioritizes reform of mandatory minimums. The retroactive reformation and alternative sentencing options allow people who encounter the system to return to a normal life based on things like personal history, organization affiliation, injury or death, and participation in rehabilitation programs. Their plan would allow, at best, more arbitrary sentencing. We don't want people to go to prison for petty crimes, but we think mandatory minimums are essential for hard crimes, like drug organizations, like rapists, like child abusers, like folks who hurt people like DJ. I want to end with what Noah and Jasmine started with. Mandatory minimums are key to preventing crime. If potential criminals know that a sentence is guaranteed, they will be less willing to commit a crime. Mandatory minimums guarantee that criminals are kept away from society for a minimum amount of time, preventing them from quickly reoffending. This gives victims justice and allows offenders to consider their wrongdoings and address the harms that they've done. Mandatory minimums were first introduced in the mid-1980s. Around that time, the violent crime rate peaked at 758.2 per 100,000 residents. In 2018, it was down to 368.9 per 100,000 people. After mandatory minimums became part of sentencing, the violent crime rate was almost cut in half. The ability to deter crime is a key part of this debate. We have shown that federal mandatory minimums are effective and necessary. The crime reduction we have witnessed in the United States reflects a judicial system that holds citizens accountable for their actions. We've been taking steps in the right direction to ensure the safety of the public, as seen by the First Step Act and safety value exceptions. These, along with enhanced rehabilitative programs in prisons, reduction of minimums, and the Fair Sentencing Act, are all steps we have already taken to fix sentencing errors. The decrease in recidivism rates and the expedited federal sentences speak for themselves. The current problem is the lack of accountability, not the statutes that safeguard our society. Abolishing mandatory minimums will only make things worse. A small change to sentencing practices just isn't enough to prevent aggressive policing. The risks of abolition are much worse. Packed courts and slow trials, a rise in violent crime, and an atmosphere of social distrust. This debate is about accountability,
Don't forget about the survivors of abuse. Don't forget about DK. Don't forget about the 4 children harmed at the hands of Jason Williams. Don't forget about the countless other names. Judges, if you want to protect fairness, justice, and safety, you should vote for the team that prioritizes the safety of the community, accountability for heinous crimes, and reforming our current system from our past failures. Thank you for your time.
Hello everyone, my name is London, and I'll be reading the second affirmative constructive. I currently face a mandatory minimum, as well as every speaker on my team, and in total, our team faces a minimum of 198 years behind bars. The United States criminal justice approach has been to incarcerate our way to safety, with failed success. Instead, we must reconfigure our criminal justice system to prevent mass incarceration, protect civil liberties, and increase public safety. In addition to the reasons my teammate Khalil presented, mandatory minimums must be abolished for the following reasons. First, mandatory minimums waste fine resources, which should instead be redirected to programs that deter crime, decrease recidivism, and increase public safety. Second, mandatory minimums create undue corrosion, forcing individuals to accept plea bargains regardless of guilt and threaten the defendant's constitutional Sixth Amendment right to trial. First, as Mark Muir, the Executive Director of the Sentencing Project explains, mandatory minimums produce diminishing returns with negative consequences for public safety, including diverting finite resources away from programs with demonstrated success in deterring crime and decreasing recidivism. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission in 2023, the average sentence length for mandatory minimums was 151 months or 10 years, resulting in total annual costs to taxpayers of $4.6 billion. These costs cannot be justified, given that, as Khalil described, mandatory minimums do not deter crime. Further, these finite resources should be spent in some programs that do deter crime. For example, Federal Bureau of Prisons estimates suggest that detention costs account only for roughly 1/3 of DOJ's overall budget, crowding out priorities such as additional prosecutors, investigators, and policing, which have been shown to reduce crime. We are not arguing that longer sentences are never justified, but mandatory minimums group classes of offenders for lengthy sentences costing billions in taxpayer dollars, despite the fact that these lengthy sentences are not deterring crime. Most crimes require rehabilitation, not unduly harsh sentences that harm rather than enhance public safety. In short, taxpayer dollars should go toward cost-effective solutions that work instead of outdated and ineffective policies like minimum sentencing requirements. We should start by tying the hands of our judges and letting them do their jobs to find appropriate sentences that include rehabilitative alternatives rather than costly sentences. Second, as Allison Syker of Chicago Law states, mandatory minimums provide prosecutors with weapons to bludgeon defendants into effectively coerced plea bargains. This creates undue leverage for prosecutors, undermines criminal justice goals, and threatens defendants' constitutional right to jury trials. First, mandatory minimums have not decreased sentencing disparities because they have not eliminated sentencing discretion. As Supreme Court Justice Breyer observed in a concurrence, mandatory minimums just transfer sentencing power to prosecutors who can determine sentences to the charges they decide to bring. Because any number of criminal statutes might apply to a defendant's conduct, there's usually a wide array of charges from which the prosecutor can choose, some carry mandatory minimums and some not. Prosecutors, biased party, can thus leverage mandatory minimums to secure convictions. And unlike judges, prosecutors' charging determinations lack transparency. Instead, judges, neutral parties, should have sentencing discretion. Second, the effects of the undue leverage prosecutors will through mandatory minimums, including by extracting plea bargains, undermines the goal mandatory minimums were enacted to achieve, consistency and fairness. Empirical studies and exoneration data demonstrate that the pressure of facing a long mandatory sentence causes even innocent defendants to plead guilty. Even if you assume good faith by the prosecutor, risking a sentence of 20 years when offered a plea of 2 years would make any reasonable defendant, even an innocent one, consider a plea, creating a justice system that prioritizes the number of convictions over justice. Further, more culpable defendants who have information about criminal schemes, often as part of violence or organized crimes, can avoid minimums through cooperation, while less culpable defendants or worse, innocent defendants who have no information face harsher penalties. As the Sentencing Commission explained in 2024, defendants also may be encouraged to plead to a different charge to avoid a mandatory sentence. In other words, the punishment quite literally does not fit the crime. Third, mandatory minimums also strip defendants of their constitutional right to trial. As written in New York Times and how mandatory minimums are weaponized, quote, the message that prosecutors send to them and to so many other defendants is clear. If you consider exercising your fundamental right to trial, we will seek penalties that are so excessive that you will think twice because we have the power to take sentencing authority away from the judiciary. Requiring the government to meet its burden of proof at a public trial to an impartial jury is enshrined in the Sixth Amendment. No one should be required to gamble with decades of their liberty to exercise that right. But as shown by statistics, when an individual is forced to plead to avoid a long mandatory minimum, that right to trial is in name only. As cited in Pew, when the regimen of mandatory minimums began more than 30 years ago, 20% of federal cases were resolved by trial. Today, fewer than 2% are, and more than 98% of cases are resolved by pleas. As articulated by the National Association of Criminal Defense, defense lawyers spend most of their time negotiating guilty pleas rather than ensuring that police and the government respect the boundaries of the law and meet their burden of proof. Equally important, the pressure to plead guilty and plead early is often accompanied by a requirement that accused persons waive many valuable rights, including the right to challenge unlawfully procured evidence and the right to appeal issues. This means that defendants waive procedural protections and fundamental rights in roughly 98% of federal cases, or receive a penalty for exercising constitutional rights. As John Adams wrote, representative government and trial by jury are the heart and lungs of liberty. President Adams' colorful language reflected the truth of his view, a view shared by his contemporaries, that the right to trial and jury protects our liberties every bit as much as the right to cast our vote for our representatives. Yet, we have allowed mandatory minimums to take away the right to trial by jury and with our constitutional protections. Think of an example. If a prosecutor says, I'll shoot you if you don't plead guilty, the plea is invalid. But if a prosecutor threatens to charge a defendant with a crime punished by death, at trial, this threat causes the defendant to accept the plea agreement, this method is lawful. Imagine being a 20-year-old woman, a first-time offender, no criminal background, and 24 weeks pregnant when arrested. To exercise her fundamental right to trial, she faces a mandatory minimum of 49 years, and even eventually was forced to give birth while incarcerated. This woman is me, but this is only a part of my story. I'm not arguing that I should be held accountable for my crime, but only how justice is administrated. If people like me are charged with a set sentence that cannot take into account anything about who I am or what I could be, we cease to recognize the humanity and mercy and fairness that is meant to underpin our democracy and justice system. No one deserves to be forced to forego their Sixth Amendment right to trial to endure a long prison sentence rather than having a chance to change. If mandatory minimums do not deter crime and increase rather than decrease recidivism, why are we not allowing judges to make individualized determinations to ensure that people have a chance to change? Education and rehabilitation is the real deterrence and solution to crime. Educational programs like this one is why my team and I stand in front of you wanting a different path. So before my team and I leave today, we ask that you remember, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Each of us deserves to be a chance to be considered as an individualized person and not a statistic. And it starts by abolishing mandatory minimums. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't know how I'm gonna go after that. Good afternoon. My name is John Ross, and I am currently shackled by a 7-year mandatory minimum, as many others on my team. If I exercise my constitutional right to trial, I face a mandatory minimum of 49 years. Our opponents argue that mandatory minimums should be abolished because they decrease costs, incapacitate criminals, and is needed for violent crimes like terrorism. Let me start with decreased costs. They say mandatory minimums decrease costs when in fact, abolishing mandatory minimums is essential to lowering costs. As we have continuously stated, mandatory minimums increase prison stay and population and substantially contributes to mass incarceration. Increasing costs to taxpayers without the benefit of decreasing crime or recidivism. Incarcerating an individual can cost $30,000 to $60,000 a year, which can be much better spent on programs that rehabilitate convicted individuals to prevent future prison stays and subsequent calls. The DOJ in particular could reallocate the 1/3 of its budget spent on incarcerating people to instead hire additional law enforcement officers and prosecutors who can solve and deter more crimes and ensure the public safety we're all longing for. They also say that mandatory minimums incapacitates criminals. As we frequently reiterate, increasing the length of prison terms for federal offenses does not deter crime. Instead, it increases public safety or reduces recidivism. Extended sentences result in hardened criminals, especially without access to rehabilitative resources and much-needed family ties. Some of the strongest components for reducing recidivism, thus, while long sentences and incapacitation may be necessary in certain cases, mandatory minimums consequently extend prison stays for offenses that are not deterred by long prison sentences and are contrary to public safety goals. They also say that mandatory minimums are needed for violent crimes such as terrorism. To be clear, we are not arguing that long sentences are not appropriate in certain cases, which may include violent crimes or terrorism. But mandatory minimums are not the answer. Mandatory minimums do not deter crime. It is the certainty, not the length, and no terrorist or violent criminal who thinks their sentence is uncertain. In short, mandatory minimums do nothing to deter violent crimes and have the detrimental effects of inequality and unfairness. Let me ask you, are they saying that someone charged with murder should get less time than a non-violent, low-level drug offense, which is the norm? Even if mandatory minimums did deter crime, the benefits of mandatory minimums cannot outweigh the harms, including the fact that increased incarceration drain many resources from rehabilitative and policing programs and decrease recidivism, and deprive defendants of their right to trial. Once again, let me ask you, they say that mandatory minimums are not perfect, but is it okay for people to be casualties of war as the government nuclear bombs their way to justice? Again, before I go, we are not arguing that lengthy sentences are not appropriate or people shouldn't go to jail. But mandatory minimums are unequal, racially biased, do not deter crime, waste resources, and are being used as a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel. There is no precision, rhyme, or reason for them. The negative fails to remember, without mandatory minimums, people still will be held accountable for their crime. Instead, we are arguing that judges should be allowed to sentence people fairly based on their individual acts. Thank you.
My name is Aisha Marks. Today, my team and I were established that mandatory minimums must be abolished. Mandatory minimums were intended to ensure consistency, but in fact, they've done the opposite. We've shown how mandatory minimums are unjust, do not deter crime, lead to mass incarceration, and waste resources. Instead, each individual sentence deserves judicial discretion. Would you rather spend millions of tax dollars locking people up for mandatory time, or educate them through and rehabilitate people through programs proven to decrease recidivism? We aren't arguing that people shouldn't receive long sentences. We argue that sentences should fit the crime and be left up to the discretion of the judge. Our opponents have given half measures which cannot be an effective solution. The most tragic thing is that almost all of my teammates, including myself, face a mandatory minimum. I'm a part of the 2% exercising my Sixth Amendment right to trial, and in doing so, I face a mandatory minimum of 30 years. I'm a mother of twins fighting for my freedom to take care of my children. Respectfully, we submit that no person should be penalized with a mandatory minimum of 30 years solely for exercising a constitutional right. Sentencing is not a math problem. Judges are not computers. People are not numbers. It is time to ask ourselves, is this the type of criminal justice system we want to have? Mandatory minimums are used as a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. For all these reasons and those that we proved today, mandatory minimums must be abolished.
This debate is about creating a sustainable model for the criminal justice system. Mandatory minimums only happen once a conviction has occurred, which means it's not a question of mass incarceration or racial biases, because those things will inevitably exist. It's only a question of how do we deal with the violent criminals and how do we ensure that we create safety of speech. They created false narratives that mandatory minimums are always bad, which is why we've made a clear distinction between the certain crimes that are always inexcusable: drug trafficking, crimes against children, sexual violence, and rape. Thus, you should not violate mandatory minimum sentences. There are two important arguments here. First is sentencing reform. Expanding judicial discretion, retroactive reformation, and alternative sentencing options all resolve justice and safety better. The counter-advocacy becomes preferable because it allows for alternative sentencing and appeals processes that reduce the harmful impacts they've isolated of the criminal justice system, while also reforming mandatory minimums and avoiding breakdowns in constitutionally guaranteed rights to a speedy trial. There's no sufficient reason why the harms would outweigh the benefits of mandatory minimum sentences. The McDonald evidence demonstrates how mandatory minimum sentences only kick in when 10,000 doses of an individual drug have been trafficked, which is an example of why these mandatory minimums are not applied to low-level offenders. But even if they are, reform would solve any reason that low-level offenders are held culpable anyway. Now, remember, we don't have to win mandatory minimums are good. We have to prove that there's room to improve the system, and abolishing mandatory minimums can never resolve racial biases because of the ways in which racial judges in the Deep South will still apply the racial biases in their sentencing procedures. Thank you.
Special guest speaker come up here. So when Judge Friedrich and I started some of these programs in the courthouse, it was, I have to say, in total candor, we were not the first to do this. There is a first person, the OG, and he's here in the building, Judge Emmett Sullivan, okay?
Darren Sullivan had a case before me. He had prior convictions, felony convictions. But he went to law school. His challenge was to become a member of the DC Bar. So the case was randomly referred to 3 judges. I was one, and I was the assigned author, which meant I wrote the opinion. I had 2 colleagues who I love dearly, who were former prosecutors. Now, they were fair-minded former prosecutors, but they weren't too keen about Darren getting admitted to the bar. Now, work was cut out for me. We spent 19 months, I did, arguing. I needed 1 more vote, because Darren had my vote. I looked at his background. He got caught up in a whole lot of crap. You know what I'm talking about. 2 felony convictions. He changed his lifestyle, went to law school. His character became impeccable. But my colleagues weren't too keen when admitting Darren to the bar. It took a lot of time. I got a chance to advocate like you people did today. That's a blessing, to stand in the well of the court and persuade judges. I've been a judge for 41 years on 3 courts, and I tell you frankly, I miss that. That's fun. That's when I'm at my best. That's why I feel energized now. To make a long story short, my colleagues came around. They voted with me. I thought I was going to have to write a dissenting opinion. They came around, but it took a lot of work. That's why I'm sharing Darren's story with you. It takes a lot of work to change lifestyles. But the DC Bar, this is the law in the District of Columbia. If you have prior felony convictions, and you then attend law school, and you change your lifestyle, and your character is beyond reproach, you can be admitted to the DC Bar and practice law and stand in the well of the court and get paid for it. I'm going to sit down, but this last sentence was added the day before this opinion was issued. I'm going to give this to Judge Baruchi so he can give you a copy. This was from my heart. And I'm sorry if I have emotion. It's very emotional. We believe our decision today is consistent with encouraging individuals who have had past troubles to turn over a new leaf and to seek admission to the bar. If Darren could do it, y'all can do it.
Thank you, Judge Sullivan. I mean it from the bottom of my heart. We would not be here, Judge Schroeder, Judge Walton, so many of us. We walked on the shoulders of you. You're the original fight of this courthouse, a champion for civil rights. And as I tell you, you're not allowed to retire. Okay? All right. I'm going to turn the microphone over to our judges. Our Chief Judge Chasnow is going to let us know the verdict of the debate, and then the judges will share their feedback. She was begrudgingly, I think, accepted my title I gave her of Chief Judge. Thank you.
I'm going to start by saying, wow. I said to my colleagues back there, I couldn't have done what any of you did. It's courageous. Look at this group you're arguing in front of. So a hat off to all of you. It was fabulous. I was very impressed. This is my first year. I hope it's not my last coming year. You're arguing in front of a group who probably had a predilection to think that logic was on the affirmative. Most federal judges aren't real fans of mandatory minimums. So you were starting with a little bit of a deficit there. And on balance, tough decision, but we do think that the folks over on the affirmative had a better go at it today.
Problem solvers, we got this. This was incredible. It was such an honor to be able to be here and to be hearing from all of you. You are incredible advocates. And I just so appreciated the passion that all of you brought to this, the research, the hard work that clearly went into this, your development of your arguments, your organization of your arguments. So I wanted to really commend you on organizing things so it's helpful for us to hear. So having a roadmap, saying 1, 2, 3. I loved how you we're putting your arm up. Help me follow. It was great. So having those well-constructed and organized arguments is so helpful for us to be able to understand them and to be able to follow along with you. So great job on those organizational pieces. And I want to take away from, I know these other judges who are in courtrooms all the time evaluating advocates. They were sharing with me in the back about how compelling your personal stories were. And thank you so much for incorporating that into your arguments, because that is the most persuasive, incredible evidence that you can provide to us. And telling us not only about the evidence, the studies, all of the facts that you're able to present, but your story is you. And it is so powerful that you're able to share that story and be standing here today. And I am so excited for what I know each of you is capable of doing and how you're going to show up in this world for your families and for yourselves. So thank you so much for coming here today. It was an absolute honor to be able to be present. And I am so impressed with y'all. You are amazing advocates, and to jump in when you have a whole bunch of judges So of course they have a lot of, smarts and they have good discretion. So you totally had the hard argument, and I am so impressed with how you were able to show up in this, fancy courtroom where there's amazing advocates and hold your own. So all of you just did an incredible job, and believe in yourself because that was legit good.
Wow is right. And I first want to thank Judge Faruqi for inviting me here, because I cannot tell you, not even close, the last time I did something that was this much fun or this meaningful. And it was all because of you. If I had 2 wishes, the first would be that your argument becomes our policy. And the second one is that everybody could see what you all did today. I mean, not just 100 or so people in here, but that everybody could see what you all did today. This wasn't an academic discussion. It wasn't an academic debate to you. It was your life. It was real stories on real people that affect so many more. And that's how minds are changed. And that's how policy is changed. And if you don't think things can change or do change, they do. For those of us who are a little bit older, remember what things were like, 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, things do get better. They get more fair. They get more just. And you will see that, and you will feel that. And, there could be some debate issues about different things or different style. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. What matters is a good, solid position that is based on what is true and what is fair and what makes us special and what makes us unique and what really reflects the best of us. And today, you all did that. You all showed that. And I'm really, really happy that I had a chance to see it.
Hey y'all. 3 thoughts. 1 constructive, 1 historical, and 1 emotional. So first, the constructive thought. It was still when I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, so that would have been 8 or 9 years into my career. I still was very wedded, even at that time, to writing out an entire script and then essentially memorizing my script. And it was at that point that I started doing a lot of oral arguments before federal circuit courts, federal district courts, discovery motions, all of the stuff that lawyers do. And I realized really quickly that I needed to get off my script. And if you know your arguments, once you start talking on the fly, you don't need the script. So I think that that's my best practical piece of advice for everyone is, one way or another, at some point you will get off the script, and the script almost becomes like a crutch. If you can get away from the script, the better and more persuasive you'll be. The second idea is more historical. Every time I'm in a new courtroom, and this is the first time that I've been in this courtroom on this side of things, I've been, as Judge Sullivan talked about, I always take a look around. So take a look around at all of the photos or the depictions around you on the walls and all of that history. You all are now part of that history of this courtroom. So take some real pride and knowledge in that. And then third, the emotional point that I wanted to bring up is I think we all meet each other at different points in the journey of our lives. And I wanted to say that for each of you on both sides, you've impacted me and left a mark on me at this moment in time in my journey, such that you made me see the world, both of you, in a different place. So thank you for this moment in time.
Not much left to say here. I think the colleagues have covered the landscape, but I just want to reiterate some of the points that they've made already. First, both sides did a remarkable job. You all really demonstrated
an understanding of the policies behind mandatory minimums, the arguments in favor, the arguments against, and yes, Towson, I'm sorry, but not only were you dealing with the home crowd here in DC, but you also had to argue an impossible position, which is to a group of judges arguing against their discretion. What judge is not going to vote in favor of having more discretion in sentencing? So you had an incredible uphill battle, and you did an extraordinary job, great research, great analysis, and I hope that we will see you in this courthouse in the future. As a law clerk, attorney, intern, whatever, please be back. DOC, you all continue to inspire and amaze me. I love going to the DC jail and seeing you there, and I see how hard you work when you were there. And to have you in this courtroom here with us and how we spend our daily lives in this courthouse just brings such joy. It's such a privilege to see you here and to see your hard work pay off so much. I know from my law clerk, David Dockerman, who's in the courtroom, and he's been there some recently helping this amazing group of coaches, so thank all of you for your work. Just how hard each of you have worked, and you really shine today. And as I think more than one of us has said already, you really are the best evidence of why mandatory minimums don't work. And we had a mic drop moment with Mr. Cunningham in the past, and let me say, Ms. London, Ms. Teager, thank you for sharing that personal story. That truly is extraordinary, what you've overcome.
We give our best speaker from each team, and one of them is our top overall speaker. So from the team at Tufts University, we wanted to recognize Kenny Kebermede for being the top speaker. And then for our overall top speaker of the competition, I want to congratulate London Teeter. Quickly, if you could bear with us, just give our certificates, and then you're welcome to come down afterwards to read anyone in the audience or say anything to the students. So, but first we want to give out our certificates for completion. Charles Brooks. Khalil Hewitt. Taz. Johnny Robinson. James Kennard.
One mic.
Malcolm Grayson. clappers, do this, come on. Okay, that's going to conclude. Again, we're going to marshal stay up here so we can't cross into this area, but the coaches will be meeting with their students. Thank you again to Towson. You did the impossible coming here. We so appreciate you coming here and showing out. It really is incredible. If our judges want to come down, they're welcome to come down this way to greet any of the students on either side. Thank you.